Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall here, continuing our walk through Core52, and this week we're talking about Jesus and David, but more than that we're talking about what does it mean to be a king of the kingdom of God. Before we talk about that, I just want to get all of you talking, and I started off with a personal story from high school about how I was grossly misunderstood, and it almost got me expelled. I wonder, are you able to share a misunderstanding story, a time that you were misunderstood, maybe by your spouse, maybe by your kids, maybe at work, maybe here in the church? How much trouble did you get in? What did it take to remedy the situation? Well, 3 different parables, so let's just work our way through them. In the first parable that we looked at, there's 2 sons. Do you like either of these sons? That's the first question. Does this seem like 2 bad choices and we have to pick the best? Sometimes that's the way elections feel. How do you read this story? If that is true, that we have 2 bad choices and we have to pick the best, if that is true, how does that relate to us and God? Does it relate to us and God? How can sinners enter the kingdom of heaven before, or I told you in my message, this word could be interpreted instead of, how can sinners enter the kingdom of heaven instead of religious people? What does that mean for us? And then finally, as we work through all these parables, remember that a parable is supposed to have one single message. It's supposed to have a single meaning. It's not supposed to have a whole bunch of meanings. If that's true, what is the meaning of this parable? And each one of these parables relates to the kingdom of God. What does this parable say to us about the kingdom of God? How does it relate to the kingdom of God? Well, then you have the second parable. Now we have the vineyard here and the vineyard workers. I want you to look up Isaiah 5, read verses 1 through 7. And then I want you to look up Psalm 80, read verses 8 and 9. And then Jeremiah 20:21. And then finally, Ezekiel 15:6. And as you're reading these, what does it mean that this vineyard represents? Use these stories to answer the question, what does this vineyard represent? And then, after you've done that, what does that mean to Jesus' hearers when he starts telling this story? Do you think that there is any reason, do you think that there is any way that they would misunderstand his reference to this vineyard? What is the point of this second parable? What is the simple one meaning? Maybe not simple. What is the one meaning of this parable? And what does Jesus' addition of Psalm 118 mean? He tells the parable, they respond, and then he tells Psalm 118. What does that mean? And then, remember, each time we're asking, how does this story relate to the kingdom of God? And so how does this parable of the vineyard and the workers in the vineyard, how does that relate to the kingdom of God? Our third parable starts off with this kingdom of God language, and it says that the kingdom of heaven is like a king who threw a wedding banquet for his son. And so how does the kingdom of heaven, how is it like a wedding banquet for a prince? That's the question that we want to start with. Remembering that a parable has one meaning, what does that mean that the meaning of this parable is? And then it's dangerous. This is what we tend to do. We tend to press the details of the parables. And that's dangerous. That's not exactly what we're supposed to do, but we still do it. So if you press the details of this parable, it has different characters in it. Who do you think that the characters in this story represent? Last question. If Jesus really is king over the church, what difference would that make for us as citizens of his kingdom? Do we see our lives and choices as an important part of God's kingdom purposes? Well, every week I remind you of what our application was. And our application this week is for you to come to me, or to come to Pastor Dave, or to come to Pastor Reagan, or to come to Pastor Jacob, to ask a pastor. You might have another pastor friend. Ask a pastor, what are the practical differences between someone being a citizen of the kingdom of God and someone being a church member? Well, I hope that you have a great group, And I look forward to seeing you next Sunday as we continue our walk through Core 52. God bless.